All right. Before getting into the substance of our presentation, we want to note that Transgender Day of Visibility is on March 31st, 2023. The Cambridge City Hall is currently lit up in light blue, light pink, and white this week in celebration of all trans and non-binary people in Cambridge and around the world. Trans Day of Visibility occurs every March to honor and celebrate transgender and non-binary people and their contributions to society. We also want to acknowledge the adversity, poverty, discrimination, and violence that the trans and non-binary communities continue to face across the world, especially towards community of color. We also acknowledge the discrimination against youth and older adults, which causes social isolation, anxiety, depression, and even suicide. Therefore, we remain committed to uplifting trans and non-binary residents and visitors to the city. For today's session, I will start by giving a quick overview of the Human Rights Commission and discuss our complaint process, as well as who can file a complaint with us and who those complaints can be against. I will then cover LGBTQ protections under our Fair Housing Ordinance, as well as the Federal Fair Housing Act. Next will be a discussion about examples of LGBTQ discrimination, as well as enforcing LGBTQ protections and possible outcomes of our complaint process. I'll also go over some best practices as a current tenant or an applicant for housing. Lastly, I will discuss the different enforcement agencies. Q&A will be at the end of my presentation, but if we're doing well on time, I will try to answer questions during my presentation. For the folks on Zoom, you can either raise your hand on Zoom or enter a question into the chat box. So what do? The Cambridge Human Rights Commission is a city law enforcement agency that receives and investigates complaints of discrimination, not only in housing, but as well as employment, education, and public accommodations. We're charged with enforcing two ordinances, the Cambridge Human Rights Ordinance, where the employment, public accommodations, and education complaints fall, as well as the Fair Housing Ordinance. These ordinances prohibit discrimination on protected categories, such as race, color, national origin, sex, physical or mental disability, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, age, which is 18 up, family status, marital status, military status, and source of income, which means receipt of public assistance, such as Section 8 or any sort of public assistance. So now that you have a general understanding of the Human Rights Commission, let's discuss jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is the authority granted by an ordinance to the commission to investigate and rule on legal matters. And that's based on the subject matter of the case, such as discrimination, as well as the geographical region where the issue took place. At the commission, we can accept discrimination cases that occur in the city of Cambridge. This means that a complainant can live outside of the city, but the respondent business, institution, housing provider, or individual alleged to have discriminated must reside in the city of Cambridge. The other element that must be met is that the discrimination must have occurred within the last 180 days, which is roughly 6 months. There is an exception if the conduct is ongoing and it began before the 180-day mark. And lastly, the alleged discrimination must have been based on the complainant's membership in a protected class. Lastly, we cannot accept complaints against other City of Cambridge agencies. However, those complaints can be filed at the Mass Commission Against Discrimination, which I'll talk about later on in my presentation. So next, I'll just go over quickly what our complaint process looks like. So our complaint process begins with interviewing complainants to make sure that the complaint meets our jurisdictional requirements. Then I would help a complainant draft a complaint, but keep in mind that I don't represent any complainants. And then that complaint is served on a respondent or the person that the complaint is against. That could be the landlord, property manager, a maintenance worker, etc. For housing complaints, respondents have 10 days to respond. It's 21 days for employment cases. After that, I would usually interview witnesses, review relevant documents such as leases, email communications, and review relevant case law. With any complaint that is filed, we do endeavor to conciliate or mediate disputes between parties. If that is successful, that is great. Then I would draft a predetermination settlement agreement and the case would be resolved. If that isn't successful, then I would draft at the conclusion of my investigation a either probable cause or lack of probable cause determination. If probable cause is found, then we attempt again to mediate a complaint. And that would often include public interest provisions such as anti-discrimination training for any respondent, a change to procedures or policies, or other public interest provisions. We also sometimes ask for a financial remedy for the complainant. If there's probable cause found in specifically a housing case, either party can elect to send that case to the Attorney General's office for filing. The AGO would then represent that person's public interest. If lack of probable cause is found, we do not have an appeals process, so at that point, the case would be dismissed. So who is protected in housing discrimination cases, or who can file a complaint with us? Our ordinance protects applicants for public housing and private rental apartments and homes, as well as those who are in shelters and commercial spaces. It also protects tenants in apartments and homes, public housing, shelters, or commercial spaces, as well as potential home buyers and complainants who speak out against discriminatory housing practices. And lastly, credit and mortgage seekers. So who can be found liable for housing violations? Our ordinance covers owners, landlords and their employees, real estate agents and agencies, apartment managers, management companies, banks, mortgage companies and appraisers, homeowners insurance companies, and public housing authorities. So that means Cambridge Housing Authority is under our jurisdiction. Cambridge Housing Authority is not a city agency. So basically, if you're on a deed, you may be liable, and that would include an absentee landlord. The only exception to our ordinance are owner-occupied homes with 2 units or less, or if the person is renting a unit in their home. But there's exceptions that might take a complaint out of that exception. So please contact us, even if that's the case. So next I'll go over LGBTQ protections under the Fair Housing Ordinance and the Federal Fair Housing Act. We're proud of Cambridge's longstanding commitment to protecting the rights of the LGBTQ communities. The law actually changed in 2020 because there was an employment discrimination case that reached the Supreme Court called Bostock versus Clayton County. In Bostock, the plaintiff, Gerald Bostock, was fired after he expressed interest in a gay softball league at work. The court held that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act's prohibition against discrimination because of sex actually covered discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity as well. This was a landmark case because then in 2021, President Biden signed an executive order requiring these protections of LGBTQ people to expand to housing, healthcare, and education. In that executive order, President Biden cited the Bostock decision. And what this executive order required was that applicable federal agencies, including HUD, need to spread actions consistent with Bostock. This also resulted in new HUD regulations explaining the protections of LGBTQ people under the Fair Housing Act. So what that means with the commission is that if someone files a discrimination case based on sexual orientation or gender identity, it will be dual filed with HUD because they see us as substantially equivalent to the Federal Fair Housing Act. So therefore we are able to investigate it on their behalf. So next I'll go over some examples of what this discrimination can look like. Of course, this isn't an exhaustive list. These are just some examples of cases that we may receive. So the first would be a landlord refuses to rent a house to a same-sex couple, but rents to couples of the opposite sex. A transgender tenant reported to their housing provider that a maintenance worker was harassing them because of their gender identity, and the housing provider did not take action to protect the tenant from such harassment. A transgender female tenant who was designated male at birth is asked by the owner of their apartment building not to dress in feminine or gender nonconforming clothing in the common areas of the property. Or a bisexual tenant is evicted after the housing provider meets the tenant's same-sex partner. Some other potential signs of sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination could be prioritizing applicants on a waiting list based on sex. It could be setting different rents or fees for tenants based on sexual orientation. It could be failing to renew a lease once a housing provider becomes aware of a tenant's sexual orientation, or it could be considering a tenant's gender expression before pursuing eviction. So one type of complaint regarding the LGBTQ community that we see at times is regarding discriminatory harassment. So we'd like to go into a little bit more detail with this slide. So when someone makes a discriminatory harassment claim at the commission, we often look for three things. The first is, was the harassment unwelcome? The second, was it severe or pervasive? Keep in mind that harassment does not need to be both severe or pervasive to satisfy this requirement. That means that one discriminatory action can satisfy this requirement if it is severe enough. And finally, the harassment has to be based on a protected class or protected group. I also wanted to discuss HUD's equal access rule. So back in 2021, HUD withdrew a proposed rule that would have weakened the original equal access rule of 2016, which protects transgender individuals in shelters and other HUD-funded housing. In withdrawing the 2020 rule, HUD noted that it was inconsistent with two executive orders. And what this means is that under the equal access rule, a person must be approved for shelters or programs based on their gender identity, even if their official identity documents state a different or conflicting gender or sex. There can be no intrusive questions that are allowed about a person's sex or gender identity or sexual orientation. No steering or limiting access to facilities or amenities based on a person's gender identity. And the housing provider must address the behavior of the aggressive party, not the victim. And you have the right to be placed in a shelter of the gender with which you identify. Some examples of discrimination under HUD's equal access rule are the following. A transgender woman sought housing at HUD-funded women's shelter in Cambridge, and during the intake process, the shelter staff refused to address her as female, misgendered her, and made other statements to discredit her gender identity. The shelter staff refused to shelter the transgender woman at the facility, but offered to place her in a man's shelter or in isolation. A non-binary person applied for a voucher through Cambridge Housing Authority with their partner. While completing program verifications, their companion puts her arm around the applicant. The specialist believed that the applicant and their partner are lesbians and denies the application because of perceived sexual orientation. So it is very important to know that you have rights and protections under our ordinance, the Fair Housing Act, and the Equal Access Rule. Keep in mind that it is prohibited for any housing provider to discriminate against LGBTQ persons and because of their real or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity, and is also unlawful sex discrimination for any housing provider to deny housing because of someone's actual or perceived HIV/AIDS status under the Federal Fair Housing Act, if based on the housing provider's stereotyping of LGBTQ individuals. Housing providers are encouraged to create environments where everyone feels welcome and safe. It is also unlawful for a lender to deny a mortgage to any qualified applicant based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. And lastly, it is unlawful for HUD-assisted homeless facilities to segregate or isolate transgender individuals based on their gender assigned at birth. So what are possible outcomes of our complaint process? As I mentioned before, we do attempt to mediate or conciliate all complaints, which can happen before the finding of a probable cause. Complainants can ask for monetary compensation, and we would typically ask for public interest provisions such as anti-discrimination trainings or revised policies. If probable cause is found, the remedies for a successful complaint for housing cases may include damages. And these are expenses actually incurred because of an unlawful action, usually related to moving, storage, or obtaining alternate housing, especially if the alternate housing is more expensive, as well as civil fines. We also wanted to note some of the best practices for tenants, and this could also apply for applicants. It's very important to keep a paper trail of communications between you and your housing provider, and we do encourage email when possible. We also encourage documentation of any evidence of harassment by other tenants or evidence of different treatment by your housing provider or different terms or conditions. And lastly, we encourage any reporting of retaliation for engaging in protected activities, such as filing a complaint with us or another enforcement agency, or reporting a housing violation. I'll go into more detail about this in the next slide. Regarding retaliation, please note that retaliation is covered by our ordinance as a separate claim. It is illegal to retaliate against any person for making a complaint, for testifying, assisting, or participating in any manner in a proceeding under a complaint process at any time, even after an investigation is completed. It is also illegal to retaliate against any person because that person reported a discriminatory practice to a housing provider or other authority. So if you believe that you have experienced retaliation, you can file a complaint with us. One example would be if a resident complains to a manager that they received a 10-day notice to quit because of her gender identity. The manager then could get angry and send them an eviction notice. That would be an example of retaliation. And these are just some other forms of discrimination cases that we often see. So some other discriminatory actions would be inquiring about membership in a protected class, refusing or delaying to rent, lease, negotiate, or sell, discriminatory terms or conditions, misrepresenting availability of housing, or altering terms or conditions of housing, steering, which means when you encourage someone to go elsewhere because you don't want them to live in a certain neighborhood, discriminatory lending, discriminatory advertising, or use of intimidation or coercion. And another one that I didn't include here would be a denial of a reasonable accommodation or modification as well. These are the three main enforcement agencies. So HUD, as I mentioned, is the Federal Fair Housing Agency. And one key difference between HUD and us is that they have a different statute of limitations. So you have 1 year to file a complaint with HUD, whereas you have 180 days with us. The Mass Commission Against Discrimination is similar to us, but they're the state discrimination agency, so they cover the whole state. So if a complaint is outside of the city of Cambridge, we often would refer to HUD. They have a 300-day statute of limitations. And then, as I mentioned with us, we enforce our local law, our local ordinances, as well as the Federal Fair Housing Act, and we have a 180-day statute of limitations. So this is our contact information for anyone interested in filing a complaint with us. There's different ways you can go about that. You can call that number you see there, 617-349-4396. You can send an email to our HRC email. And you could also visit our website where we do have an online intake form. We also have interpreter services available, and we could accommodate folks in any way. And you could also come to our office to meet with us in person if that's preferred.
So Carolina, we do have a question in the chat. Let me pull it up. What would steering look like? How would you know when it's enough to be against fair housing?
That's a good question. So if you're meeting with a realtor and you said that you're interested in renting an apartment in a specific neighborhood, and they made comments such as, oh, you might want to consider this other neighborhood, or they try to redirect you somewhere else, that could be evidence of steering. And also, if you have a question, if something is discrimination or not, you're welcome to call our office so we could do an intake and look into that. So even if you're not sure, please give us a call.
And if anyone has any questions, now is the time for Carolina. We'll have this open for the next couple minutes. So feel free to raise your hand or
So there's actually
write
just
in the chat.
3 more quick slides.
Oh, there's 3 more? Oh,
Yeah, no worries.
Sorry.
These are really quick. These are just other resources to keep in mind, no worries. So these are just some web sources to look at. So the Office of Housing Liaison is a great person to contact if you have housing questions in the city of Cambridge. As I mentioned, the Mass Commission Against Discrimination is where you would want to go if you want to file a complaint that's outside of the city of Cambridge. Also, the Attorney General's office, they have a civil rights division. They also accept intakes. And then that's a contact for HUD. You can directly file complaints at HUD, but if it happened in Cambridge, they would likely defer back to us, but that's still an option. And then I just wanted to put in a plug for our Fair Housing event, which will be on April 29th. It's called Fair Housing for All at the Cambridge Public Library at 449 Broadway. Please come check it out. There'll be a lot of information tables with many city partners, as well as 2 panels. One that I'll be on with MCAD and the AGO called Understanding Housing Rights. And there'll be another panel at 1 about advocacy opportunities. And it'll be a lot of fun, really great. We hope to see you there. Okay, now I'm done. Thank you.
So yes, the chat is open to any questions. If you have anything else you'd like to ask Carolina during this time, thanks. That includes the people in the audience too. You can go up to that podium and the microphone is on.
Sure. So assisted living such as in terms of rights, being protected from discrimination. So and if you're in assisted living, any sort of like harassment or different treatment is of course protected. And those are the kind of issues that we've seen. So that's something that we push for in terms of living in a housing environment where you feel that your rights are protected. That's very, very important. So in rooming houses, there are, in terms of like protections from discrimination. There's only some exceptions with like owner occupied housing. And if it's, someone's renting an apartment in their home, it might take it out of our ordinance, but there are exceptions to that. So if there's an issue like that, give me a call.
I'm sorry to interrupt. If you have any other questions, the people in on Zoom could not hear. So if you press the push button, if you had any more questions, okay. Carolina, do you mind summarizing what the 2 questions were?
Sure. So the first question was, are there rights and protections in assisted living for the LGBTQ community? In which I answered that, of course, there are, especially regarding being free from harassment and different treatment. And then the other question was regarding if there's similar protections in rooming houses or shared spaces, which there are.
Thank you. And there's one more question in the chat. The question, what are the protections for LGBTQ plus people in assisted living? Oh, I'm sorry. You're just repeating. Thank you for adding that.
No worries. All right. If anyone wants to ask questions offline, please shoot me an email or call the number in my PowerPoint. I'm happy to talk offline as well.
And I'm just gonna set up the next slideshow. We
Great.
have.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. So there is one more question in the chat. Sorry. Just gonna. What if someone so what if someone is not out to all their neighbors and someone finds out? Sorry. Was that the question? Okay. So what if you're not sure if you're being discriminated against? Can you still come to the Human Rights Commission? And if you're outed by your neighbors or someone, if your neighbors find out that you're and you're not out, would that be part of a complaint?
So it could be, because our laws also protect like perceived sexual orientation as well. So if that is creating a hostile living environment, that is something that our ordinance protects. So of course, yes, you could give us a call if that's happening, especially if that's impacting your living in any way in your home. Oh, sure. All right, I'm very, very excited to introduce our next speaker, Treyandre Valentine from the Mass Trans Political Coalition, will giving us a presentation on their work, and we're so happy to have him here.
Thank you, Carolina. Good evening, everyone. My name is Treyandre Valentine, and I am the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition. Just to share a little bit more about MTPC, that's what we like to call it, not an acronym because it's a pretty long name. MTPC is the oldest trans advocacy organization in the United States. We work to advance our work to advance towards lived equity for trans and non-binary people in Massachusetts, and not just equity under the law. And we strive to do this through cultivating trans and non-binary leadership, building economic, political, and cultural power for our community, and increasing the capacity of businesses, organizations, institutions, and other systems to be inclusive and affirming. And just a little bit of background about MTPC as well. Our work has mostly been focused on securing legal protections for trans people in Massachusetts. And that took up pretty much the first 18 years of our existence. And so we're 22 now. And since in 2018, Massachusetts became the 18th state to fully protect transgender people under the law. And so now that the organization's work was done, we could now actually respond to the needs of our communities. And so our programs and services include the Trans Leadership Academy, which is a workforce development program designed specifically for low-income, BIPOC, trans and non-binary individuals, as well as folks who were formerly incarcerated. We also provide the Identity Documents Assistant Network, which is a program to help folks legally update their IDs. We are working with Namesake, which is a trans-led business, to provide an online platform that seamlessly helps people with updating their ID documents. And we also provide financial assistance because this process can be very expensive. We also have GEAR, which stands for Gender Euphoria and Affirming Resources. We provide free products, free garments, free resources for folks. And we also have the Trans Health Coalition, which is a coalition of a number of organizations that work together to end exclusion in healthcare. And also we provide education and training so that folks in Massachusetts can be inclusive, affirming, and responsive to the needs of our community. This was our programs and services are based off of our community needs assessment that we conducted in 2019. And so I will take you through the results of that needs assessment. And just to give a little bit of background, there's not a lot of data on transgender people. We are consistently excluded from research. Most of the research on transgender people only focus on HIV, and that is very specific to transgender women. It excludes transgender men, it excludes non-binary folks. And so the National Center for Trans Equality every 5 years conducts a national survey of transgender people in the United States. The most one that was recently conducted was actually in 2022. And so we are awaiting the results. So most of the information that we have of transgender people in the United States is actually quite outdated. And so with MTPC, we conducted a needs assessment to really understand what transgender people and non-binary people are facing here in Massachusetts. Now, we got about in Massachusetts, we have approximately 45,000 trans and non-binary folks, although that number is sort of like an estimate. Again, we don't really have comprehensive surveys or census around trans folks. And so the needs assessment that we conducted, we gathered 339 surveys from folks across the state. And these folks were also included folks who were incarcerated. And so we asked folks about different areas of need. We asked folks about their safety. And as you can see, public harassment was the highest, as well as suicide. We had sexual violence at 47%, bullying, abuse by a family member, and partner abuse. And so we asked these questions to really understand the concerns in terms of safety. And you can see these numbers are pretty stark, right? The next one we asked was around basic needs. And this included employment, housing, being able to pay your bills, access to gender affirming resources, education, and food. And you can see that employment and housing were the highest of concern, as well as being able to pay your bills. Even in Massachusetts, folks are still being denied jobs. They are still being turned away. They're still being fired. And so all this is still happening in Massachusetts. The next thing that we asked folks about was health and social support. So in terms of healthcare needs, the biggest concern was insurance coverage. being able to being able to have a knowledgeable provider. So we have folks in the state who are still not knowledgeable about transgender people, transgender medical care, and access to gender affirming hormones and or surgery. And so even though we do have these protections in Massachusetts, folks are still facing discrimination and they're still experiencing barriers to the things that they need. And we asked about social support, just connection to, really like connection to community, right? And over half of the respondents reported isolation. And isolation is a really, it also exacerbates the issues that people are facing. And I do want to say that this was conducted in 2019, so this was before the pandemic. And we know that the pandemic has also exacerbated a lot of these issues. We also then asked about access to specific services, what places that folks think need more training, and what are the legal needs of folks. So in terms of access to services, the biggest was mental health and counseling support groups. So behavioral health, right? That is still, I still get emails all the time about folks seeking, like, do you know of an affirming therapist? Do you know where I can find support groups or counseling? And most of the support groups or the resources in Massachusetts often focus on, for transgender people, focus on folks who are under the age of 25. And so once you reach 26 and older, it becomes really, really hard to find any kind of support. In terms of training, we have places, we have healthcare places, the workplace, government and public agencies, as well as educational institutions that our community is saying that you all need to be trained. Even other LGBTQ organizations were named as places that needed to be trained. We have a quote here that says that we know that one-off sensitive trainings do not work. There's something, it needs to be implemented. It needs to be part of the process. And it needs to be something that is consistent. In terms of the legal needs of folks, the number one was ID documents, having ID documents that match your authentic self. A lot of our community members do not have that. This was 78% of the respondents. Also accessing legal help and interactions with the police. And so this needs assessment was really helpful in MTPC designing our strategic plan for our 3-year strategic plan for between 2020 and 2023. Now it's actually going to be extended into 2024. But this is pretty much, our community is driving our work. So just want to share with you ways in which you can actually support the trans community. One, reflect the language that someone uses for themselves, right? Using the pronouns that people use for themselves, using the names that you hear people using for themselves, reflecting the language that folks use. And also being mindful, sometimes there is insider language. So some things you might hear might be like, oh, I thought that that was something that was discriminatory. And in that case, it's okay to ask. It's okay to ask, be like, this is my understanding of the word. Is this a word that I can use for you? Or would you like me to refer you something else? If you don't know the pronouns that someone uses, ask. I think it is, we often assume the gender of folks, right? And and in that we run the mistake of misgendering people. And so if you don't know pronouns, it is okay to ask. And I also recommend that when you introduce yourself with your pronouns. Now, I didn't do that, so I can do that now just to demonstrate. My name is Treandre Valentine, and my pronouns are he and they. And so sometimes people use multiple sets of pronouns. There's no one right way or one way to be trans, right? So people can use multiple sets of pronouns. Trans people look differently. A trans person cannot speak for all of trans people. And so there is not one right way to be yourself. You don't have to understand someone's identity to respect it, right? If it's not your identity, you're not going to fully understand it, and that's okay. Again, not making assumptions, being mindful of gendered language. Sometimes when we are talking to a group, we say, hey guys, not everybody's a guy. Or sometimes to be polite, we might say ma'am or sir, and some people do not identify with those terms at all. When we are talking to a group, sometimes you might say ladies and gentlemen. I just want to be mindful that not everybody, that does not fit for everyone. So thinking of non-gendered language to use, like folks, my peoples, my posse. And also speaking out in support of trans people and trans rights. It cannot just be left up to the disenfranchised communities to fight for what's right. We do need our cis allies, our cis accomplices to be in this fight alongside us. And when you hear people's experience of discrimination, validate it. Right? That goes a really long way. Educate yourself, take it upon yourself to learn about the issues that are affecting trans people, about policies that are affecting trans people. I know there is a lot of information out there. There is also a lot of misinformation. So make sure that these are coming from trusted sources, like organizations like MTPC and the National Center for Trans Equality. There's also the Equality Federation and Transgender Law Center. So there are a number of places where you can find information and educate yourself. And then when we're thinking about forms or filling out forms, I know a lot of us have to fill out forms here at City Hall. Are these forms truly inclusive, right? When they're asking about gender, first of all, is it necessary to ask about gender? Because sometimes that is information that's being collected. But a lot of the times on forms, sometimes it's not a very necessary question. So that's something to rethink. And also making sure that there are a number of options for folks in terms of identities. Making sure that everyone has access to bathrooms and other facilities. Here in Massachusetts, we have the public accommodations protections, so that protects transgender people in public spaces like bathrooms, hotel rooms, locker rooms, gyms, the T, parks, but making sure that you are when you see or hear someone being policed in terms of it being a gendered space, being someone that interrupts that, and also knowing that the law protects you, right? Being an advocate for equity and inclusivity, not just equality. sort of need to move beyond equality and really thinking about inclusivity. And that looks like developing and implementing policies and really sort of like working to change the system. So working with like your local government agencies to really ensure that they are being inclusive. And these are just a number of ways. There's not one way to support a trans person or to support trans communities. There are many, many different ways that you can do that. I think it takes you just to go beyond educating yourself, but action. And action also looks many different ways. So you can volunteer in an organization, support, offer resources, try to collaborate with community members. But it goes a long way when cisgender people are in the fight alongside trans people. We do have, again, state laws that protect us, and but yet we also know that that the state laws only go so far. It is about not only implementing them, but also a real look at our values and how we show up for people and how we show that we value people. If you would like to stay connected, join our mailing list to stay connected about news, about the organization and things that are happening. Definitely feel free to reach out. And I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
So we do have a few questions in the chat. Let me just try to be adequate here. Let's see. Would gear include things like gaffs and binders? Are these accessible or free to minors? And like, is shipping included?
Absolutely. We currently have, I believe we have tucking underwear, we have trans tape, and we also have binders. If you are interested in receiving any of these items, we'd be happy to ship them out to you. Everything is free. We cover shipping. And yes, we definitely offer them to minors.
Are there any best practices on bathrooms, like gender-free, or I think this question goes to the labeling of it.
Absolutely. I think in terms of best practices for labeling bathrooms, restroom for all. I saw a sign that had just many different types of folks on it, and it just said restroom. Some places have all gender bathroom. That's the sign that they use. I have seen in some places where it does say male and it does say female, and as well as this is for anyone who identifies with this gender. You are free to use this bathroom.
And do you have a sense of the experiences of trans people in public/subsidized housing?
I think that's a little bit harder because there are more so like specific instances in terms of housing that people do reach out to us for. But it is, I think, sort of general experiences of being sort of like misgendered, mistreated, not necessarily being included in decisions, right? But we don't have any sort of like specific reports to that.
And I'm just verbatim reading here. At one point, there was an app in development for finding gender neutral restrooms in public. Do you know of any updates?
I don't know of any updates. I don't think that anything has been done further with that. What I do know is that there's currently a bill at the State House to basically pass. It's about updating a plumbing code so that new buildings, renovations, and new constructions, or anything like that will have gender neutral bathrooms. And it's not necessarily demanding that they have gender neutral bathrooms. It just means that they can make gender neutral bathrooms, because right now you actually have to ask for a very specific, for permission, basically.
Variance.
Exactly. So it just changes the plumbing code.
And I will open it to our audience if anyone else has a question. No? You guys are okay. Great.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you inviting me. Have a good night.
So last call for general questions, in case if you had any more for Carolina. And we still have a couple people on the line, or a few people on the line. So happy to, if you want to raise your hand or just throw something in the chat, happy to address you, but then we can also end early.
Also, real quick, everyone, I just wanted to put in a quick plug. We're currently accepting applications for this Cambridge LGBTQ friendly housing task force. You do not have to be a City of Cambridge resident to apply, but basically what the task force will do will be to consider opportunities for new or revised practices and procedures to improve LGBTQ persons' access to and inclusion in existing housing. The task force will also evaluate possibilities for new housing to be more LGBTQ plus friendly, and the task force will ultimately issue a final report with concrete recommendations and action plans for ensuring LGBTQ housing access, safety, and inclusivity in Cambridge. So if interested, you could reach out to us directly or look on the Cambridge website for more information.
Fantastic. Thank you. I hope everyone has a good night, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.